Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back for another episode. I'm absolutely thrilled today to have back with me Sultan and James Tillen. They are both with Miller Chevalier. James heads the FCPA practice group and is the vice chair of the firm's international department and co-lead of the workplace culture and conduct practice. And the reason I'm so thrilled to have them back, in addition to the fact they're a great guest, is we're going to try and unpack a series of announcements from the Department of Justice literally up to this week. So, guys, first of all, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you. Good to be back.
So, we've had lots of announcement, lots of policies. We had some speeches around those. And I wanted to maybe start with the developments that came out Monday, specifically around the FCPA and the new DOJ policy memorandum released by, or at least under the signature of the DAG, Todd Blanche. Where do you guys want to start with that document?
Sure. So maybe explain why they had to issue it in the first place. And the June 9 memo is in response to the president's executive order from February 10th, pausing enforcement of the FCPA to allow the DOJ time to consider changes in how to investigate and enforce the law in line with the administration's policies and priorities. And so this memo establishes those guidelines that will govern all current and future FCPA matters. When I say future, at least for this administration. And they have two stated goals for this. One is to, and I'm going to read their exact language here, limit undue burdens on American companies that operate abroad, and two, targeting enforcement actions against conduct that directly undermines U.S. national interest.
So, two fairly innocuous statements that probably no one in this podcast would disagree with. What do you think this means in practice?
So the memo directs prosecutors to take three particular actions that I think go to your question. The first is to focus on cases in which individuals have engaged in criminal misconduct and not attribute non-specific evidence to corporate structures. The second is to proceed as expeditiously as possible in their investigation. And the third is to consider what the DOJ is calling collateral consequences. And they give a couple of examples. They say potential disruption to lawful business and the impact on companies' employees. And specifically, the DOJ memo says that these should be considerations throughout an investigation, not only at the resolution. For a few years now, more than a few years, but going back 10 years, the DOJ has already discussed a specific goal of targeting culpable individuals. This goes back to the Yates memo on individual accountability, 2015. So not a big change from that perspective, from a practical sense, but this one is a little bit different because it doesn't specifically say that they'll pursue the individual. It's more so directed towards companies still. And so what it might mean is the DOJ could be signaling that it won't pursue companies for general compliance program weeks. What they're looking for is for situations where there are bad actors within a company. So that can have some significant practical consequences. And then in terms of proceeding as expeditiously as possible, the DOJ really doesn't give us any further information on what this means. Yes. So we'll see. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out. At the moment, or before the pause, FCPA cases were taking years to go through the pipeline. It's possible that the DOJ is trying to speed that all up. And then the collateral consequences one, I think, is particularly interesting. It's something we haven't seen as a focus in written DOJ FCP related guidance to date, but it fits within the business-friendly approach that the administration has been signaling or is trying to signal. I'm sure that every outside counsel practicing in this space can join me in saying that they've made arguments to the DOJ that one request or another had potentially disruptive features as part of general pushback and trying to narrow and tailor requests. So this could be an acknowledgement of that, and also along the same lines of being business friendly to the business.
And how about the phrase not attributing non-specific malfeasance to corporate structures? Does that mean if there's a failure of internal controls, they're going to either not look that way or not look at it at all, or maybe leave it to the SEC? Or I think a large part of what we all do is making sure that the framework is in place to prevent, detect, and remediate.
Yeah, let me jump in and take that one. So the DOJ has traditionally asserted in such documents as the FCPA Resource Guide and in the Justice Manual and in the corporate resolutions themselves that the general principles of corporate liability for the FCPA, meaning that a company is liable when its directors, officers, employees, or agents act within the scope of their employment, commit FCPA violations that at least in part benefit the company, that there'll be corporate liability there. And they've implemented that approach over the past few years while also weighing various factors in charging of corporations that are set out in the corporate enforcement policy, which, as we'll talk about, was just recently amended in May 2025. So what this new approach that's in this June 9th memo, in addition to that, we also have another source that from the same time period, June 10th, the next day, Matthew Gagliotti, the head of the DOJ's criminal division, he stated that June 9th memo directs the DOJ to focus on specific misconduct of individuals rather than collective knowledge theories. So the language that you quoted, plus what Gagliotti said, raises some questions about whether the DOJ is backing off of its traditional stance on corporate responsibility for employees and agents, or is it instead merely furthering its more corporate-friendly environment that's been established by their revisions to the corporate enforcement policy and reemphasizing the prioritization of individual prosecutions, which Ann stated is nothing new. In my view, the more likely scenario is that the DOJ will use the revised corporate enforcement policy to guide FCPA prosecutions rather than take a more dramatic stance away from the legal principle of corporate responsibility. But we're going to continue to monitor this space to see if there's any indications of a greater sea change.
One of the things that I thought was difficult under the prior administration, particularly based upon remarks of Kenneth Polite, and you guys may have your own views on this, was what was extraordinary cooperation? Because in his speech, he essentially defined it as one, we know it when we see it.
Yeah.
Two, we can't explain it because it's double secret probation, much like an Animal House, but we'll let you know if you're doing it. So for people like you have to actually implement those words. And certainly we had some hints that it meant turning over documents or information quickly, turning over things that the department had not yet determined was a violation or potential violation, so pointing them in the right directions, and generally providing witnesses, documents, et cetera. Did you see anything in this memorandum which at least gave us some further clarification of this extraordinary cooperation?
So nothing in this memo specifically, but the DOJ did release a few weeks ago its corporate enforcement voluntary self-disclosure policy, revised CEP, which took out the term extraordinary in discussing the kind of cooperation that could lead to a declination or a reduced penalty. And to me, I think that's actually very valuable. I always saw the extraordinary cooperation not just problematic from the perspective of we don't know exactly what they mean, or what you exactly just said for Mr. Polite, we know it when we see it mentality was problematic, but also it always seemed to me like a moving goalpost, because as soon as a company does something, it's not extraordinary anymore for the next. I remember when that word was first publicized as part of the previous administration's policies. I was moderating a panel and I asked from SEC and DOJ officials whether they thought it was a moving goalpost or not. And neither one had a real answer to it. It was more of the same, extraordinary compared to the standard that we have. But what exactly is that standard and can it change? So I'm happy to see that word come out of the guidance.
And that really leads me to, we're looking at this, I think, retrospectively now in terms of the release of information from the Department of Justice. Prior to the FCPA memorandum, we had I'm going to call it, or it's been characterized as a white collar plan. How does the FCPA memorandum either fit into, supplement, or in any other way relate to the white collar plan? And do you guys see a kind of a coherent pattern beginning to emerge, with addition to the CEP and of course the whistleblower program?
James, jump in. I'll just start us off on this one. I think we're seeing a lot of the same themes and a lot of the same language come out in the recent policy changes and the new policies. So, for example, there's a focus on, in the white collar enforcement plan, the more traditional sorts of criminal activity like Ponzi scheme, fraud. There's an emphasis on threats to the U.S. economy, to American competitiveness, to national security. There's an emphasis on prosecution, compel-related activity, transnational criminal organization activity, and also an emphasis on moving cases through expeditiously. And all of those things we're also seeing in this latest DOJ.
Yeah, exactly. And the whistleblower, for example, just taking the whistleblower program that you mentioned, the priority areas that they added to that are exactly along the lines that Ann said. It's related to cartels and transnational criminal organization, federal immigration laws, material support of terrorism, trade-related offenses like sanctions, tariff and customs fraud, corporate procurement fraud. And in these documents, the enforcement priorities, the whistleblower, and now in this FCPA one, they're continuing to hit these themes, and they've recalibrated the FCPA so that it's prioritizing cases that have an impact on American businesses, which then they also link to national security. And so this America First policy is just appearing in all these various policy statements and guidelines.
So one of the things that intrigued me about the FCPA memo was, and picking up on what you said, James, was a specific call out of U.S. national security interest. No surprise there, but they talked about extractive minerals. They talked about infrastructure. I even read into there perhaps software or AI. So we had business interests articulated in a way as national security interests that I hadn't seen in FCPA enforcement before. Any thoughts around those issues?
Yeah, you're exactly right. And I think so ports and minerals obviously sound specifics, but then they have this large catch-all. And the way they explain it throughout the memo of the fact that they've tied basically safeguarding U.S. national security interests to economic prosperity, it really means that anytime an American business overseas is impacted, that could have national security implications. And what they're looking for is that they're going to prioritize investigations that harm U.S. businesses. And in addition to using FCPA, they're also going to be using FIPA to go after officials whose demands for bribe cause harm to U.S. entities and individuals. So I think this is going to do two things. One is significantly reduce the number of cases overall, because the DOJ is going to likely not investigate a U.S. company that pays a bribe in a situation where it doesn't impact another U.S. company. If it only harms non-U.S. competitors, it's not going to be of interest to the United States. And two, that they're going to be more likely to go after foreign companies, non-U.S. companies, whose actions have harmed U.S. companies. Now, I think that's going to create some issues with other countries, for example, because such an approach could be seen as a breach of our U.S. treaty obligations under the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention, which has Article 5, which requires that parties' enforcement decisions shall not be influenced by considerations of national economic interest. So it's that I think is the most dramatic, at least in my view. I think, and you might have a different view about, I think some of the more dramatic language in this FCPA guidelines document is literally saying that they likely walk away from things unless U.S. economic interests are harmed.
Yeah, I agree with all that, James. And I'll just add one thing that's interesting for me is how a U.S. company could prove that its interests were harmed, or how the government could investigate whether the U.S. company's interests were harmed. Are they going to start interviewing foreign officials who are responsible for government procurement and asking them, would you have picked the U.S. company if the foreign one hadn't paid you a bribe? It'll be interesting to see how it plays out.
So how about a couple of the other earlier pronouncements, specifically the corporate enforcement policy? Because I'd love to get into your thoughts of, did something really change? And then, of course, the whistleblower program. And James, your comments about FIPA made me wonder, is the Foreign Extortion Prevention Act subject to the whistleblower program, which I'll leave that till a little bit later. But let's focus on the CEP. Do you think we have really made a shift, or we had a presumption of a declination previously and we just have a different one?
Yeah, I think it's moved the needle, certainly, but I think there's still intangibles at play. So the policy essentially guarantees a declination if there's disclosure, cooperation, remediation, but no aggravating factors. So it's the DOJ that determines whether there are aggravating factors or not. Now, what it did appear to do is that they made the list of aggravating factors exclusive instead of non-exhaustive. So limiting the number of factors at play, and in fact, removing some of them. And so that's of benefit to corporations and who are before the DOJ. It also gave the prosecutors more discretion to recommend a declination, even when there are aggravating factors based on the severity of the circumstances, the company's cooperation and remediation. The older version did allow such discretion, but they required a higher standard of like immediate self-disclosure, this extraordinary cooperation we just talked about, effective compliance program, and the new language dispenses with all of that. So there's likely going to be more declinations, but tangible, it may not be the word I use because there's still points of discretion for prosecutors within that framework.
Can I pick up with your phrasing, points of discretion, and see if I can unpack that a little bit? Because that's exactly kind of the rub. And I think I've had this conversation with you, James. It will include Ann in this part. I have found the discussion around self-disclosure or not one of the most difficult conversations a company can have. Certainly at the board of directors level, you're going to have senior executives there. They're going to have counselors like yourselves there. And if you make that decision, you're opening the kimono, you've lost control, etc. If you decide we're under no legal obligation to report, we are going to remediate, we're going to clean this up, we're going to make sure it doesn't happen again, and we're going to go down the road. Has the calculus of that conversation changed? Are you still in the position where you have to say there are factors we just can't put a number on or can't give you certainty around?
Yeah, it's certainly a really fact-specific analysis in every circumstance. But the other unknown now is how this administration will proceed overall and exactly how it will execute on these policies that it's put forward. One thing that you noted, Tom, is this question of there's no legal obligation to report, because that's often this gray area where we function in the FCPA world. There's no legal obligation to report. So it's constantly a pros and cons analysis. Every company will treat this differently. Every fact situation will be different. I don't think we're yet in a position to say, yes, you should definitely disclose every violation, or you should not disclose because you won't.
Yeah, and that's the problem, is that we're in a place where I think you don't want to be first here because you want to see at least how they issue one formal public declination and the rationale that they have in that, or conversely, how if they go forward with one corporate enforcement action, why they did that in that situation. Until we have a little bit more data, it's just these words on a page that you don't know how they're going to be applied in practice yet. So it is something where you have to do this careful pros and cons analysis, consider whether the the issues will come to light in any event because of a whistleblower, because of a media report, because of an investigation in a different country or enforcement action. And that may be the ones that drive disclosure more so than saying, here, I know from this document that I will definitely get a declination.
There's one other thing in the new corporate enforcement policy that I just have to call out because I'm a complete geek on the calculations under the sentencing guidelines. I've been studying this for 15 years. I know it as well as anybody, and I still have no clue how they do it. It is the most opaque system there is. But the new CEP, the 2025 corporate enforcement policy, said it would be 75% discount off the low end of the sentencing guidelines. And that is hugely significant because in prior enforcement actions, there's a range in the sentencing guidelines, high and low. And then if there are aggravating factors, the DOJ would take it above that minimum point. And that increase could be an additional 10 million. It could be additional 100 million in fines. But by taking it to the minimum, literally that can save a company hundreds and if not hundreds, tens of millions of dollars. For me, that was significant. But like I said, I'm a geek on those matters. Let's turn to the whistleblower program. This has been, in the DOJ's eyes, apparently a very successful program. Starting under the prior administration, the pilot program for whistleblowers, this administration has expanded it out to areas that they believe are prioritized within the administration. Anything new in the whistleblower program that you guys saw? Is it really just a continuation of what we had in the past, plus an expansion of some other specific areas?
I would say it's just a continuation. There's been no changes to the eligibility or other mandates from how it was initially rolled out. It's just that they've added these new subject matter areas for which they welcome tips from whistleblowers, such as cartels and trade-related offenses. And so it's the same program. It's just that it now reflects the priorities of what they want to hear about from these whistleblowers. I don't know if Ann, if you had a different take, but that was generally my impression.
Yeah, that was my sense too. I think they've been happy with the program and they're expanding it to new areas. One other interesting thing that I find is the DOJ is pushing for whistleblower reports, not just in this world of crimes, but also key TAM cases under the False Claims Act. They're really trying to get people to come to them with various sorts of tips to help fuel.
So if we could maybe summarize or try to put all of these together, and I'll go first because all of us wondered what the announcement of February 10th meant. Now we've had a series of policy announcements, and there are some reprioritizations, some shadings, perhaps, I don't even want to say a major change, maybe a middling change, but really not anything that I saw to be inconsistent with prior enforcement of the FCPA, with perhaps the exception of there will be no more policy or enforcement actions involving facilitation payments, no matter how high. Other than that, do you guys have any kind of sense at this point of the changes that we've seen, recognizing we have no examples to see how this is put in practice?
I think if you're a non-US company with subject to US jurisdiction, say you're an issuer but headquartered outside the United States, you should still be extremely worried about the FCPA. And if the activity has any connection to more clear interest to national interest, like it relates to China, for example, or a critical mineral or something like that, it sounds like that's exactly what the kind of cases they want to pursue. I think maybe if you're a corporate executive for a US company, you may on its face think this gives you a little breathing room over the next few years regarding your priority list. But I think that that's the short-term view. I think this actually puts more pressure on corporate compliance programs. There's this language about, okay, we're not going to go after business courtesies or low dollar or things like that. Does that mean now you're going to get expected to approve a lot more lavish entertainment? And what issues does that raise for you under local enforcement, or just the sheer cost of it and the more pressure on the compliance department? So I think for compliance officers, it's good that the FCPA has restarted and there's some guidance to look at, but it's not going to make their job any easier. And in fact, could make it more difficult. I think, Ann, you and I have been talking about that point for a while.
Yeah, and I agree with everything you said. Just will emphasize this issue of the routine business practices and entertainment, because I think it's an issue not just for American companies, but potentially for foreign companies too. There could be a growth in requests for these sorts of smaller kind of payments across the board if the enforcement emphasis.
Yeah, we're going to have a lot more foreign officials at the World Cup next year than we would have otherwise. So they've helped soccer.
That presupposes they can get a visa.
Yeah, it's a very good point.
I was going to ask this question, but I think you answered it, James, but I'm going to tee it up specifically so I can get a great clip from you guys. And that is Miller Chevalier is well known for its Latin American practice. Lots of clients down there. You guys have been down there for a long time, both for U.S. companies and Brazilian or other Latin American companies. What are you telling those Latin American companies right now? Or can I just summarize what you answered, James, which is be very aware and put compliance as a priority?
Yeah, and I would add to it that FTOs, cartels, that is the priority coming out of the administration, and it overlaps with FCPA. And the fact that they're willing to bring these anti-terrorism act cases, that they are gung-ho on going after matters involving the cartels, means that companies that are operating in Latin America need to be doing risk assessments to find out where they may have points of contact with cartels, including officials controlled by cartels, which is where that FCPA overlap comes in, as well as FIPA, and ensure that your policies and procedures are up to snuff. Luckily, using some of the strategies we use for FCPA and sanctions and money laundering can help address that risk, but more may be needed in certain areas. You may need to expand your due diligence to counterparties you didn't cover before, or go deeper and consider other things like how you transport your goods or your people within the region. And so I think that is the risk area that's extremely hot for Latin America right now.
Final thoughts, Ann?
I would say also watch out for violations or potential violations of areas that are FCPA adjacent, money laundering, tariff evasion, all of those sorts of issues that might not quite be an FCPA violation, but can definitely get you in trouble as well.
Well, guys, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time for this episode. The firm has written some great client alerts on all of these, and we're going to link to those in the show notes. I can't wait to continue this conversation.
Great. Thank you, Tom.
Thanks so much, Tom.
Compliance Podcast Network. Start your mornings with daily compliance news, quick, sharp updates on the top compliance and ethics stories in under 5 minutes every morning in Compliance Podcast Network. Because compliance never sleeps. Need practical advice fast? Check out Compliance Tip of the Day. One actionable idea to level up your program. Short and sweet, every day on Compliance Podcast Network. Got 10 minutes? We've got the week's top 10 stories. 10 for 10 brings you the big compliance headlines. Fast, fun, and focused. Every Saturday on Compliance Podcast Network. And don't miss the Sunday Book Review, where compliance meets culture through must-read books and big ideas every Sunday in Compliance Podcast Network. Whether you're in the office, on a walk, or commuting, stay smart, stay ethical, stay tuned. Only on the Compliance Podcast Network, available wherever you listen to podcasts.